Hello. This video lecture is going to go over the Italian Renaissance for AP Euro. This is the first of two Renaissance topics we'll be talking about. We'll talk about the Northern Renaissance next, which includes all the Renaissance stuff outside of Italy. But in this lecture, we're mostly going to focus on Italy and how Italy started the Renaissance and how it affected and impacted the rest of Europe. The term Renaissance comes from Swiss historian Jacob Burckhardt, who's pictured here. Burckhardt wrote a text in 1860, which kind of was meant to kind of point to this idea of the Renaissance, which hadn't really existed previously. That he argued that this was a special time in history that was unique to Europe, did not happen anywhere else in the world. It did spread throughout the world, some other historians would say that, but that the Renaissance was unique to Europe and was one of the guiding forces that pushed Europe into the modern age. Now, there's lots of disagreements people have had with that over the years. The Renaissance didn't impact everyone, and it impacted some rich people, some patrons, some nobles, some artists, some merchants perhaps, which are still rich people. But we don't really see peasants throughout most of Europe or even Italy really being impacted too much by the Renaissance. It wasn't a special time that really moved Europe forward. Many would argue, it didn't really, end feudalism or do things like that, that really drastically changed the way of life for Europeans. So it's a contentious subject sometimes, for historians and things like that. So let's kind of go forward and see what the Renaissance was about, because it wasn't just an artistic movement. It had a lot of things to it. So what caused the Renaissance? There's several features, several factors that went into creating the Renaissance. Number one, since the Renaissance begun in Italy, we have to look at the economy and the government of Italy, and those two factors really did help start the Renaissance. All of Italy at this time was broken up into city-states, almost. You can see over here you have all of these city-states over here, Florence, Venice, Milan, Naples. They're today known as Italy. They're parts of Italy, but back then they were small kingdoms that really were ruled by a small group of elite people, of merchants and other rich people and higher up government officials. These city-states more or less were very wealthy in the 1400s, and they grew their wealth through trade for the most part. As you can see on this map over here, we see Italy connected to Turkey, to Egypt, into the Middle East, and Italy was one of the main traders with this region. Going back to your 7th grade history class, we learned about the Silk Road and Marco Polo and all that. Italy was really kind of dealing with the impacts of Marco Polo and Europe's rediscovery of the Silk Road. Even though ancient Rome did trade with Silk Road traders during the feudal ages, during the Middle Ages, Europe kind of forgot about that. But in this time, after Marco Polo's exploration and writing, Europe again became enamored with the East, with China and Asian goods. So we do see a demand among the elites of Europe for these fancy goods, because they're just tired of all the same old European wool and things like that, even though the wool trade was lucrative for some in Europe. So to get these goods, the Italians traded with the East. They traded with the Byzantine Empire while it existed. But slowly that does go away. In 1453, we do see the Byzantine Empire collapse finally, with the Ottoman Turks capturing and seizing Constantinople. Big year for the Turks in 1453. And that empire will stay present in this class until, the very second last unit during World War I. But we do see the Italians, do attempt to trade with this part of Europe. They try to connect with any traders they can get, so they can get access to these goods. They get access to these goods, and because these goods are already pretty expensive coming in from Asia, you know that the Chinese and other Asian traders did jack up the prices and put taxes and trade things on these goods to make them expensive. We then see the Italians also sell these goods for a hefty price, recouping their costs and making a handsome profit on top of what they gain from these trades. When the Ottomans seize Constantinople, we see the prices go up even more. Christian Europe did not like the Ottomans, did not like Muslim cultures, such as the Seljuk Turks who came before the Ottoman Turks. So there was a lot of hostility between these groups. The Italians still did do some trading with them, but it became even more limited and difficult after this period, and that caused the price of goods to go up even more. So to get these Asian goods, the nobles and the rich people of Europe had to go through an extensive trading process, which was difficult. And then after 1453, it became even more difficult and expensive. Another factor that really contributed to the Renaissance, was this wealth accumulation that allowed these rich people to get lots of money so they could eventually pay for artists. We see big patrons such as the Medici family of Florence. They were originally cloth producers, but then they expand into commerce, banking, real estate, and things like that, and just become this big, gigantic, wealthy family that has commercial interests and eventually political and religious interests. They develop bank branches throughout Italy and even into Northwest Europe, London, and France, etc. They become very close to the papacy and the Pope. But the families like the Medicis, they paid for art and paid for writing and paid for things like that really helped the Renaissance artists flourish. If you're an artist or a writer, you can't write or create art and then eat it. You need to pay. You need to fend for yourself somehow, and that was through a patron. Patrons really allowed these people to survive with their wealth and protection and support. Without that, it would have been difficult. And again, a lot of these families were tried to and gain their wealth from trading with other parts of the world, particularly Asia, when they could. And again, the Italians really did control a lot of this trade. This is going to lead into the second half of this unit, the Age of Exploration. Spain and Portugal, right there, still a part of Southern Europe, still pretty close to Italy there. They're going to be blocked out of this trade, and they're going to want a way to Asia that kind of bypasses Italy's kind of monopoly on trade, because you can kind of see literally Italy blocks them from going east and getting to Asia. Looking at this map right here, so they're going to want a way around Italy and around these trade ports. A third factor that allowed for the development of the Renaissance was the urban aspect of the Italian peninsula. With this close-knit, urbanized population in Italy, you have this population that can really bounce ideas off each other and connect with each other. It allowed for competition, which pushed people further. It also allowed for collaboration and things like that. When you have a spread out country, such as like a Germany or a France, where there's lots of farmland in between cities and urban centers, that's not going to allow for things like art schools or printing areas to develop as easily. So we see we have a more urban culture develop in Italy that allowed for the Renaissance to kind of develop at a quicker pace. And then lastly, we see the last big influence of the Renaissance was an individual person, Petrarch. There were a few writers and thinkers that really could have pushed the Renaissance and begun the Renaissance. It wasn't just up to one person. History, usually doesn't rely on one person. There's a few exceptions, which you can maybe guess on who those individuals are. You might have your own opinions, but most of history doesn't just rely on one person to get things going. And I would argue that's probably the case here. However, according to the College Board, Petrarch's influence, his singular influence, was important, and it's not incorrect. It's not an incorrect statement. But Petrarch, he founded the idea of humanism. He helped lay the foundation for the Renaissance by doing a few things. He characterized the prior period to the Renaissance as the Dark Ages, and that stuck. probably learned about the Middle Ages, or the period between the Renaissance and ancient Rome, as the Middle Ages or Dark Ages. That's not uncommon. I've taught that before. He and others like him rediscovered ancient writings from Rome and Greece, particularly ancient Rome, particularly writings from Cicero. And he supported the secular ideas embedded in these writings. Even though he was a Christian and believed in Christianity, he embraced the secular nature. Not everything had to be tied to religion. Secular, of course, means non-religious or moving away from religion. That's not the case for pretty much anyone in the Renaissance. No one's willing to critique the Catholic Church like a Martin Luther character would have. But secular just means you can have things and think about things that aren't tied to religion. You can have art, writing, thoughts, beliefs, activities that are non-religious. And that's an important distinction. In this period, the whole world revolved around Christianity and the Catholic Church in some aspect throughout most of Europe. If you're a peasant living in a village or a king on a throne, you are there because of God. And your life revolved around God and the Catholic Church and going to church and supporting the church. There's really no exceptions, unless you're a religious minority, such as a Jewish person or a Muslim living in Europe in this time, which there weren't too many of in different cases. However, if you're anyone else in Europe, you're tied to the church. This idea of secularism that begins to emerge from the Renaissance began to challenge that idea. We'll go further into that in this lecture and future lectures. All right, so what are some ideas associated with the Renaissance? There's several isms, several ideologies that we associate with the Renaissance, and I'll kind of walk you through the big ones. First big one is humanism, as I just previously stated, with Petrarch kind of helping develop this idea. But humanism is developed on the potential of man, humans creating their own destiny, controlling history, and being all that they can be, being their full human self. And it wasn't, it kind of sounds like it's self-explanatory a bit, but humanism is just the idea that humans did things and achieved things because they're man. Not necessarily because God was there, even though, again, the Renaissance is not an anti-religious movement. It's just saying that man has the power to create change and control history. And you could add on to that, and according to God's will, that they can act out what God wanted them to do. It's, again, not an anti-religious idea. It's just that humans are capable of doing things and achieving their control of destiny to an extent. To go along with that, it's not stated there, but there's an idea below it called civic humanism. This is the same similar idea, but it's more based on government and things like that. That in government, you should apply humanist principles to serve your people, to serve your kingdom. Again, there's really no democracies in Europe at this time, but people should come together to support these ideas and honestly model their government on ancient Rome prior to Julius Caesar and the Catholic Church kind of intermingling into Rome. A lot of the humanist Renaissance thinkers like Petrarch and his friends believed that the most perfect form of government was that of ancient Rome, and the Roman Republic specifically, prior to Julius Caesar's takeover that turned it into an empire with a dictator, more or less. But civic humanists believed that we could learn a lot by reading these writings from people like Cicero and his friends from ancient Rome, and that that's what people should follow. And this gets expanded upon by people like Machiavelli, which we'll look at in a second. Another big idea from the Renaissance was individualism, the idea that we should promote and follow individual ideas. We should have our own personality, self-expression, and not be as collective and communal. A big trend in early modern Europe or pre-modern Europe was this idea of the collective community, where you live in your village as a peasant. And again, 95% of Europe was a peasant living in a village of some sort, perhaps in a feudal system with lords and knights over them and things like that. But your strength is in the community and the communal nature. The Renaissance began to challenge that and saying that there can be some individuals that can improve and shape things and change things for the better, and that goes back to humanism as well, right? But individual ideas and identities can be powerful, was that idea. Another idea I've already mentioned is the idea of secularism. And again, this ties into some previously expressed ideas such as individualism, humanism. But secularism is just the idea that not everything has to be centered around the Catholic Church. Again, no one is challenging the importance of the Catholic Church. Everyone believes it's important and that everyone should be followers of the Catholic Church, but not everything has to be centered around it. You can have thoughts, ideas, beliefs that are maybe tied into science or the study of ancient Greece or the study of languages such as Latin. That you can do that. It doesn't have to be necessarily tied to the Catholic Church. A great example of this right here is the Last Supper. This piece of art is a Renaissance piece, and again, you might be wondering, how is this secular? It's based on Jesus Christ and the 12 apostles having their last meal before Jesus is eventually captured and executed by Rome. But here, a big piece that makes this a secular piece is looking at the individual personalities. While this is has a religious subject matter, when you look at the different apostles, kind of looking like they're arguing or bickering or discussing what's going on, or looking around at their neighbors or at Jesus in the center, you see lots of drama and lots of personalities. And that's really showing you that, yes, you can have a religious piece here, but there's also a whole world that is beneath the surface of drama, emotion, personality, judgment, and things like that coming together that has really kind of shown that not everything has to be about the Catholic Church and Christianity. Neoplatonism right here, these last two aren't as common. You don't see them pop up as much, but just in case you see them pop up somewhere, Neoplatonism is an idea that we see in the Renaissance, and it comes from Plato. Like I said, in the Renaissance, thinkers like to harken back to ancient Rome and ancient Greece, and searched for these texts throughout Europe that had maybe been lost by the Middle Ages or by the Dark Ages. The Ottoman Empire, kept track of them and kept them in good condition, but feudal Europe really did not keep a lot of these ancient texts in good condition. But another example of Europeans really wanting to look back to the ancient texts of Greece and Rome comes from Neoplatonism, and it's again worded after Plato, Socrates' student, one of the great ancient Greek philosophers. But this idea of everything being connected ties into religion, ties into Christianity. The idea of a soul is kind of comes from this idea of Neoplatonism, and again is also tied into Christianity. But the big idea in this is the great chain of being that kind of connects all matter of life, from the lowest plant forms to the highest and purest, which is God, and that everything is bound together by love and by connection. The last ism is Hermetism, and it actually comes from the ancient Greek god Hermes and the ancient Egyptian god, what's his name? Thoth. So these two ancient gods kind of come together, and they kind of come into this idea or this ideology that focuses on the mystical aspects of life. In this period, in the 13, 14, 15, 1600s, maybe even into the 1700s, you see Europe with a pre-scientific lens, and you see a lot of ideas in Europe that you might not have expected. Even with people like Galileo being around in the 15, 1600s, with Newton being around in the 16, 1700s, you see a lot of belief in magic and curses and things like that. Again, after the bubonic plague in the 1300s and going forward, people had their faith, their whole world shaken. Even before the plague, people believed in magic and things like that, but this belief kind of lingered for hundreds of years after the plague. It was pretty common in European courts. Now, I'm not talking about like judicial courts, but like courts for kings and queens. You have a court like astronomer, or a court astrologist, or a court alchemist that would try to make gold for you. It was very common for high-ranking, higher up people in society to believe in these unscientific magical things. Hermeticism is kind of a factor of that. So if you see anything with like magical elements or mystical elements or astrological elements, that could be related to Hermeticism. So effects of the Renaissance, there's lots of writers, lots of lots of thinkers from the Renaissance. We're not going to hit on all of them. We've talked about Petrarch, but there's other ones. So if you want a full breakdown, you can look in the summarized notes or in the textbook for some different examples of some writers. But just some examples of some writings or some authors that really impacted Italy, and then the rest of Europe are listed here. The first one we have Machiavelli, Niccolo Machiavelli. He's credited with, kind of coming up with the idea of secular models for governance and political diplomacy. He really wrote a lot about on politics, governance, the best forms of governance, and how people should do things. Now, his writing's based on maybe getting back at a political opponent. The Medicis of Florence maybe didn't like him, so he maybe wrote his most famous work, The Prince, in order to maybe snidely make fun of them or comment on them or something like that. There is evidence for that. But his work was not taken in that way when it was written, or the years after it was written. Leaders, kings, looked at Machiavelli's writings afterwards and really took it to heart and really listened to what he said, which maybe didn't make things that good for the people of Europe. When you have a king that's Machiavellian, or you have a politician that's Machiavellian, that's not always a good thing. That usually means they're kind of sneaky, treacherous, and deceitful. So what did he write? Machiavelli wrote that a good leader is one that does whatever it takes to keep themselves safe and secure, and to eventually keep their people safe and secure. If that means being evil, treacherous, murderous, that is okay. As long as it keeps your people safe, who cares what happens to anyone else? If you have to lie, and that means hurting another group of people, if that means you have to get another group of people from another country murdered, so be it. As long as you're safe and in power and your people are safe, that's all it really counts. We see this kind of trend of crude political dealings. This stretches all the way into Otto von Bismarck, the guy that helped unify Germany in the 1800s. He's credited with the idea of realpolitik and the carrot and the stick. That has large traces of Machiavelli in it as well. So his influence is super impactful. And again, not only is he giving rulers a secular model to follow that is based upon real world beliefs and ideas and how to keep people safe and yourself safe and secure, but he's also giving a model of government that is not based on the church. You don't need divine right from God to rule. You just need to keep yourself safe and secure and your people safe. And if that means being violent or awful, so be it. If it keeps you in power, that's all it takes. But again, he's giving rulers a lot to work with there, and again, giving them a model that is not tied to getting a blessing from a pope. An aspect of the Renaissance, too, is a criticism of religion. Like I said, the Renaissance writers and thinkers and artists are not anti-religious or anti-church or anti-Christian. They are very much pro-Catholic Church. However, we do see some criticisms of the Catholic Church. They don't want to start a new church, follow Martin Luther or anything like that, but they do want to just point out some of the hypocrisies or issues they have with the Catholic Church. And you could argue the Renaissance did lead into the Reformation in more ways than one. We'll talk about that in the next 2 units. But they just wanted to point some things out. One such example was by Lorenzo Valla, a Renaissance writer. He wrote about the false donation of Constantine. So going back to ancient Rome, this is an interesting story. If you remember the Roman Empire, when you have your dictators started with Augustus Caesar and that whole line of people, eventually you get to the Emperor Constantine. Now Constantine was the first emperor to convert to Christianity. And he made the whole Roman Empire the official religion of Christianity. I'm not sure what year. I want to say like 300 CE or something like that. So after that happens, Rome lasts a few hundred more years into the 500s, I believe, and then it falls apart, whatever. But under Emperor Constantine, there was a myth that was developed that Emperor Constantine, being a big fan of Christianity and a big fan of the Catholic Christian church that he donated the city of Rome to the Pope. Now today in Rome, there's a Vatican City that's a few blocks that is the territory that is owned by the Catholic Church. But back in this period, throughout most of European history, actually, the Catholic Church owned lots of land. It was a major secular power. It controlled political affairs and things like that. It did not just control people's religious belief, but it controlled government power. The Pope was a monarch of sorts, and controlled the governments of other European nations. If you're a European king, you want to make sure you're friends with the Pope, because they could just excommunicate you. Then you and your people would be damned to hell when they died, and then you have uprisings because the Pope, excommunicated your whole country, and that really freaked people out. But in this period, the church came up with documents, and they were, written in ancient Latin, or so they said, that the whole city of Rome was a gift of Constantine to the Catholic Church, and that's the way it was. Going back to Lorenzo Valla, what he did was very interesting. Being a humanistic scholar, very interested in, humanism and man's potential and classical texts from ancient Rome, Lorenzo asked for the documents the Catholic Church, said, donated the city of Rome to the Catholic Church. He looked at them, analyzed them, and realized that the Latin that was written in those texts were incorrect. They were written not in ancient Roman Latin, but in more modern, scruffy Latin. That was the Latin of 1400s, or maybe around that time, 1400s Rome or Italy. So Valla kind of contested that and said, this is not right. There's some issues and errors here, and I think the Catholic Church is making up a lie, that they actually don't own the city of Rome, and that this is a big forgery. Valla was called out by this. He was criticized. Luckily he was not killed by the Catholic Church, because they had the power to do that, and they did kill many people who made claims like that, especially scientific claims and things like that. But it just showed you that people were, kind of starting to criticize the church a little bit more. Again, not, get rid of religion or things like that, but just starting to kind of poke at this big monolithic structure in Europe that really had a lot of power. And again, that was the donation of Constantine, Emperor Constantine, which turned out to be a forgery, discovered with an education in Latin. And speaking of an education in Latin, that brings us to our last point. Education became more important, particularly history education, Latin and language education. Those became important. Again, because of humanism, because of this force of humanism that is now becoming super prominent among these rich nobles in Europe, we're starting to see rich nobles kind of become more focused on this idea. Especially if you're a noble or maybe a ruler in waiting, you're going to study history, science, the small amounts of science that exists at the time, which is really based on Aristotle from ancient Greece. And you're going to focus on those things, not necessarily just religious texts. You're still going to study religion and Christianity, of course, that's super important, but you're going to focus on the other academic areas too, not just a religious academic education. One such example was the Book of the Courtier. It was written in Italy, and it was basically a guide for nobles to create a quote-unquote Renaissance man that has knowledge in arts, politics, fencing, horseback riding, being all these fancy things that you'll need to be able to do to be a knight, but also a practical education on science, history, religion, etc. Women were pretty much excluded from education unless that education was for rich women, and then in that case you were educated on the proper ways to be a wife, a mother, a homemaker, and things like that. Unfortunately, a big theme in this class is that women are going to be ignored throughout most of this class and looked down upon, unfortunately, just seen as components of a household. That you're going to be a mother, a wife, or a homemaker, or usually all three. Last part of this lecture, I want to focus on the art of the Renaissance. That's the most famous part of the Renaissance that people probably know the most about. Before we look at some pieces there, I just want to show you some examples of medieval art. Just look around and look at what you notice. You might notice that there's a lot of religious elements in medieval art, such as the Virgin Mary and Jesus here. You might notice, everyone in every painting has the same facial expression for the most part, except for these two women right here that are now glancing at death. Everyone has the same expression. Even this guy that's getting stabbed in the head, emotionless. They look kind of unnatural and alien-like. If you look at the fingers on Mary here, or the fingers on pretty much anyone else, there's some errors and some weird things going on there. But again, that's medieval art in a nutshell, at least European medieval art. Not too realistic, not too naturalistic and based, and has certain issues with it. Looking at Renaissance art, you might notice a few different things. Okay, first, a big theme of Renaissance art was its classical emphasis, focusing not just on Jesus Christ and Mary, but on ancient Greece and ancient Rome. Going back a few slides here, this famous piece down here focused on Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, and a bunch of other famous Greek philosophers down here. In this piece right here, you see this character right here that is Aphrodite, the Greek goddess of love. Or in this case, it'd be the Roman goddess Venus. Same thing as Aphrodite, just a different name for Rome. Some people have said that this is actually the Virgin Mary, hidden in Botticelli's work, but who can say? You see Cupid, the son of Venus, again the god of love there. You see these woodland nymphs, and other goddesses that symbolize nature, spring, flowers, fertility, and all these things. So you see again a classical focus on things that's not just a focus on religion and things like that. You see again, and this could be considered heresy to some people in Europe at this time, focusing on Egyptian, Greek, Roman gods and goddesses. That didn't always fly, but here it was okay, especially when you see people melding this idea of ancient Greece or ancient Rome with Christianity. Is this the Virgin Mary or is it Aphrodite? Who can say? So they kind of covered themselves there. Another thing that you might see hidden in Renaissance art is symbolism. Who represents what? Again, going back to this figure here, this piece you see symbolize the spring and fertility and birth and the growth of humanity and the growth of humans because of the subject matter. It's not always just about people hanging out in the woods, but it could be symbolic of other things. Other pieces you see in Renaissance art is the idea of linear perspective. You see that in these two pieces here. If you want to know what linear perspective is, you might see it, in this piece down here as well. If you look and you kind of see these lines that kind of drag on right here that meet an endpoint, this is a big piece in art. It's one of the easiest ways to make a 2D piece of art that's printed on paper or on a wall look 3D. And how do we know that this is 3D? Well, if you look at these columns here, they get smaller and smaller as the painting, or as this photo of this Renaissance architectural building kind of goes on and on and on to the very end. And when you get down here, this pillar is a lot smaller than this pillar, but because the way your mind works, you know that this pillar and this pillar in real life are probably the same size. So what does that tell you? That this is at a further distance and that there's depth here. There's 3D depth. And again, that's linear perspective in a nutshell. I'm sure if you've taken art classes, you've talked about this. But again, it's the way our mind works and how it kind of tells us that we're in a 3D environment. Well, we see that across lots of Renaissance paintings. Here, you see three humans, here, here, and here. They're probably not too different in size, but you see this woman here who has a larger size compared to these two down here. Therefore, you can kind of see that there's depth here, that there's this person further away from this person, and therefore there's a 3D environment here. Same thing here. These human characters with Jesus in the middle, they're not that much bigger, smaller than these mountains back here. And we know in real life that mountains are bigger than humans. There's no way a human, unless they're a giant or something, could be the size of a mountain. But here, because we see these humans in a bigger scene than these mountains in the background, that they look closer and look about the same size, that we show that they're closer to us, and therefore we're again in a 3D environment. The last piece, last ideology that's in here again is this idea of naturalism. These human characters look naturalistic, that they are, you know, in their natural environment, they look human-like. They don't look like these Renaissance, or I'm sorry, these medieval people here that don't really look too human-like. When you look at these Renaissance people, whether they're gods or goddesses, they almost all of them look like actual humans that you could encounter in the real world. That they're not like these cartoonish characters that we see. A few other things I want to point out. First thing we see here is this idea of contrapposto. If you know Michelangelo's famous David statue, where you have a person kind of standing strong on one leg, but leaning on the other. Here you see a contrapposto. Here you see a contrapposto. Here you kind of see a contrapposto. Here you definitely see a contrapposto. Those are symbolic symbols of a Renaissance painting. You see it in other types of painting, but you really start to see it in Renaissance painting, the contrapposto. Again, weight on one leg, not a lot of weight on the other leg. Why is that important? Well, it shows that there's movement or action of some sort. If you just have someone standing firm, you know, just standing firm with not a lot of, you know, life to them, like this person here maybe, it doesn't really look too realistic. You look kind of machine-like or like a robot. It looks more realistic or naturalistic to see the contrapposto posing or stature. Another thing you see here is, in this painting specifically, is the chiaroscuro. Probably saying that wrong, but the chiaroscuro was a type of shading that was done, started in the Renaissance, but it became more pronounced in the Baroque art, which is the art movement in Unit 2, where you see shading between light and dark. When you contrast the woman to this dark background here, that is chiaroscuro. And that's, again, first seen in some Renaissance pieces, but eventually becomes the trademark of the Baroque art movement, which starts in the middle 1500s and goes into the 1700s in some cases. Lastly, I want to point out that we see civic humanism here as well. We see people paying taxes and doing the honorable, dutiful thing, and, you know, doing what's right, which is a big theme in civic humanist pieces, such as Tribute Money here by Masioko. Lastly here, we see this this architectural piece down here. This was a example of Renaissance architecture. You have a few examples of Renaissance architecture. Florence's dome, the Brunelleschi's famous dome, was another example of Renaissance architecture. But here you see it as well. This is funded by a patron, which again is a big theme of Renaissance art. All of these pieces cannot be possible without you know, patrons paying for the artists to do their work. But the architecture here is also an example. Again, inspiration from ancient Greece and ancient Rome. We see you know, linear perspective and things like that, and these ideas coming to play in the Renaissance as well. All right, so that is it about the Renaissance, and I'll see you next time.